everyone. My name is Emily Rodriguez. I'm Senior Fellow with the Dana Foundation Career Network in Neuroscience and Society. Welcome to Neuroethics 101. This is another installment of our NeuroX 101 series, co-hosted by the International Neuroethics Society. This series is meant to introduce people to different interdisciplinary fields involving neuroscience. And you can access more information as well as recordings of our previous events at neuroxcareers.com. I'm dropping that into the chat right now. We do have a chat open, but if you have questions of people throughout the event, drop them into the Q&A section, which you'll find in the bottom dashboard of your Zoom, so that your questions can kind of be saved and people can respond to them throughout the meeting. Okay, great. Without further ado, let me introduce our moderator and panelists. Our moderator is Dr. Tim Brown. Dr. Brown is an assistant professor in the Department of Bioethics and Humanities at the University of Washington. He is a longtime contributor to the Center for Neurotechnology's Neuroethics Thrust, where he supports the efforts to teach neuroethics to young investigators, catalyze ethics investigations through interdisciplinary collaborations, and promote the field of neuroethics through public outreach. More generally, Tim's work lies at the intersection of biomedical ethics, philosophy of technology, Black, Latino, and queer feminism, and aesthetics. Now for our panelists. Dr. Sarah Berger is a senior research scientist and manager at IBM Research. She received her BA from Macalester College, majoring in neuroscience and minoring in women, gender, and sexuality studies, as well as her PhD from Northwestern University, specializing in systems and cognitive neuroscience with a subspecialty in medical humanities and bioethics. Our next panelist is Dr. Asad Beck. Asad is a postdoc at the University of Washington Graduate Program in Neuroscience after graduating with a PhD from the same lab. Their interests broadly lie in circadian rhythm, epilepsy, brain-computer interfaces, and neuroethics. They joined the De La Iglesia lab in the spring of 2019 and have focused on using machine learning algorithms to forecast seizure onset in mice models of epilepsy. Eventually, Asad plans on shifting focus to epilepsy in humans as well. And finally, we have Dr. Laura Cabrera. Dr. Laura Cabrera is the Dorothy Four Huck and J. Lloyd Huck Chair in Neuroethics and an associate professor at Penn State University, where she's also affiliated with the Rock Ethics Institute and the Center for Neural Engineering. She holds a bachelor in engineering in electrical and communications engineering, an MA in applied ethics, and a PhD in applied ethics from Charles Sturt University. Her research focuses on the ethical and societal implications of neurotechnologies for both treatment and enhancement, exploring perspectives from professionals, patients, and the public on brain interventions. And now I'll hand it over to Dr. Brown.
Thank you so much, Emily, for that great introduction. And thanks to both the Dana Foundation and the International Neuroethics Society for allowing us to put together this panel for this wonderful purpose. I thought we would, as a matter of course, say a few words. I would say a few words about how I see this panel proceeding. But first, I would say a few more words about the panel and the special synergy between us. All of us are colleagues who've collaborated on a number of projects in the past. Asad was my student. I was on Asad's panel for their dissertation, and Laura and Sarah and I have been working on, or we've been scheming to think more about the intersections between neurotech research and artificial intelligence, especially the ethics of algorithms and things like that. Like, what kinds of resources can we bring to the development of machine learning and artificially intelligent devices in the neurotech space? And so, as far as I'm concerned, that's a very special synergy. Though this is Neuroethics 101, I think this could serve as a helpful frame for everyone interested in seeing what neuroethics is capable of, what it's focused on, where it's going, so on and so forth. As for the logistics of this conversation that we're going to have, we have about an hour and a half. We're going to spend 40 minutes talking together about neuroethics and about some of the issues that we face in neuroethics. for 40 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to a Q&A session. But we really want to make our special focus um, what it's like to build a career in neuroethics. So that's for those of you who are thinking about a career trajectory but want to integrate neuroethics into it, want to figure out how to make that a more central part of your career, or to make that your entire career, because some of us have done just that. So, over the course of the next 40 minutes, definitely think of the kinds of questions about neurotech and AI that you want to ask us, but also think of questions that you want answered about how to build a career that engages with ethics or is wholly focused on ethics. Okay. And with that said, let's jump in. So for each of our panelists, I would like each of you to tell me what your research focus is, and tell me how you arrived at this point in your career. And I think I'll go in the order of more junior to more senior. Well, I don't know who's more senior between Sarah and Laura. I'll go in the order of my Zoom. So let's start with Assad.
Okay, so just to make sure sort of my resources is like how I got here, it's a question.
Mm. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so as mentioned, I'm currently well, I recently graduated my neuroscience PhD and I've been finishing up some of the work in the lab. And sort of what I've been interested in even before I applied to undergrad is this idea of neurotechnology that can be used to, hopefully help ameliorate some of or variety of different like mental, etc. disorders. And so that's been like a major interest in my of mine for like the past almost over a decade now. And sort of a lot of the steps that I've been doing have been trying to get into that research space. Um, but at the same time, like, I've also had this interest in philosophy. And so as you learn about like psychology, neuroscience, things like that, a lot of these philosophical questions sort of come up naturally. And so to me, it felt sort of almost like a no-brainer, pun unintended, that, as I pursue this sort of research interest in neurotechnology, that simultaneously I do this research in neuroethics at the same time. So I was lucky in that my undergrad institution, San Diego State University, had a neuroethics course because they were like collaborating with the University of Washington, where I am now. And so sort of skipping over a little, I eventually get into my neuroscience PhD, and I'm doing mostly my work is with animal models of like looking at sleep circadian rhythms and epilepsy and so on and so forth. But in conjunction with that, I've been sort of interacting with the neuroethics group here at UW and sort of, you know, trying to sort of straddle the line between the more neuroscience experimental work and the more neuroethics sort of work, and sort of trying to, bridge the two in a way that what bridge the two in the way that feels like sort of natural. And to me, it hasn't really felt too forced at all. It's just, as I mentioned, a lot of these questions sort of come up naturally for me. And so, yeah, my hope is that as I sort of continue on with my trajectory, that I keep this sort of blend of the two. Yeah, I think that's it for me.
Absolutely. Let's hear from Laura now.
Yeah, so what is my research focus? I would say so neurotechnology has been at the center. Though I take neurotechnology like to encompass a very broad type of, both devices, pharmacological interventions, even some of the kind of societal infrastructures that we have and how, neuroscience systems or neuroscience interventions are deployed have become more and more a part of my most current interest. And I guess it's important to remember that I come from engineering, right? So my big interest has been in the technology space for this is the beginning of my career, and I wasn't particularly interested in neuro per se. So I was doing research in nanoethics when I started my master and the very beginning of my PhD. And then I had this opportunity to go to a boot camp for non-neuroscientists in neuroscience. And that was really the thing that moved or shifted my career to neuroethics, right? So it became evident to me at the time that this was the field that allowed me to bring my interest for technology, my philosophical inclinations as well, as Asad mentioned, so this interest in philosophy, and then the super cool idea of the brain. I get to bring all of these together and build a career on it. So that's kind of has been the focus of my interest, right? And in terms of research, I think I already mentioned that a lot of technologies I've done through my career. So I started with neuroenhancements, mostly focused on pharmaceutical enhancement. As I moved to brain stimulation, started from non-invasive, and now I do most of my research in neuromodulation, both invasive and non-invasive. And I do a lot of public perceptions around different publics as well. And so, yeah, I really enjoy my work, my research.
Absolutely. So do I. I enjoy your research. Sarah, you want to tell us about your career trajectory, your focus?
Sure. So before saying much else, I wanted to say that everything that I say today is my own viewpoints, my personal and professional views. They don't represent that of my employer. So how did I get here? What I do now is I work on a team at IBM called Responsible and Inclusive Tech. And we try to very broadly create frameworks, methods, tools for getting technology practitioners, technologists, developers, just to start thinking more broadly about the impacts of their work, getting them aware of what's happening, embedding different kinds of ethical and social and legal frameworks into practice by design, and hopefully over time changing technology culture. That is a big if, but that is like the ultimate goal. And the technologies that we focus on are mostly AI and quantum, given that we're at IBM, but because also of the nature of my research, people have also let me also think about these things and develop these kinds of frameworks for neurotechnology as well. How did I get here? So I always knew I wanted to be a neuroscientist. Like even as a kid, I was one of those kids. And I applied to Macalester because they had an undergraduate neuroscience program. And while I was at Mac, I fell in love at the same time with women, gender, and sexuality studies. So my career was already being influenced by, I don't even want to say interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary thinking throughout. And then when I got to grad school, I was focusing mostly on neuroimaging and like sensory technology to measure pain. And something had happened where someone who read a paper of mine wanted to use the algorithm that we had developed for a purpose that was completely antithetical to what I wanted. And that freaked me out. It was going to be for like insurance, and I was trying to help pain patients, and it was just a mess. And I felt like I was not prepared for that. My IRB didn't prepare me to think like that, dual use. And then that led me into medical humanities and bioethics. And so I basically had these kind of three different things: neuroscience, ethics, and women, gender, and sexuality studies. Mostly feminist and critical disability theory was what I was interested in. I never thought I was going to be in a tech company, but an opportunity presented itself. I took it, and now I find myself in this weird mix of sometimes doing actual machine learning research, sometimes doing AI ethics, sometimes thinking about this from like a neuroscience standpoint, sometimes practically thinking about the intersection points of neuroscience and AI. So I get to kind of, as Laura said, I kind of have somehow created this nice mesh of things that I care about, although I can't say that it was intentional. It was accidental in many ways, but yeah.
Absolutely. I feel that we don't talk about this enough, though I do hear about this every career panel, about how careers are nonlinear, how our trajectories don't go from point A to point B. They're more like roller coasters with all the associated anxiety. And some of it does feel like the line on the way to the roller coaster. So I think that's important. But also, there's a sense in which like our identities as researchers are made up of a bunch of different parts. So it's not just like Oh, it's nonlinear. It's kind of like a quilt made up of different squares. And you could hear from our three panelists that there's a lot going on with all of us, but I haven't actually answered the question myself. Someone muted? Oh, okay. Okay, good. Cool. Yeah, I haven't actually answered the question myself, so I'll answer the question as well. So what's my career focus? How did I get to this point? I started off as a humanist, a philosopher by training, and my undergrad and early graduate experiences were all about the philosophy of science and making that as weird as possible. I remember I did a lot of feminist philosophy of physics, specifically quantum mechanics. That's strange, but not as strange as you think. I see Sarah smirking. I think you know what I'm talking about. Also Assad. But I came with a reputation. And so when I arrived at the University of Washington, their PhD program in philosophy, there was a motley crew of neuroscientists and electrical engineers and computer scientists who were putting together brain-computer interfaces, capitalizing on maybe 3 decades of research that had already been done there. They were going for a National Science Foundation Engineering Research Center grant. These are like 10-year-long grant programs to build a center. And that center became the Center for Neurotechnology. But that motley crew of scientists were extremely worried about the implications of building brain computer interfaces and what implications that had for the future of humanity. So they reached out to a number of different people across campus who had, ethics research in their backgrounds, and they found they found Sarah Goering and me and a number of graduate students who are also interested. And we became the neuroethics group, and that's the group that Assad was referring to earlier. It's still going. I think it's been 15 years now, if not going on 15 years. So this has become sort of an institution. It's how I got to this field. I never thought I would be doing neuroscience, but in a lot of the research that I did earlier on neuroscience, I mean, on in the philosophy of science, there are a number of people who are deeply influential on me. I had a lot of conversations about the category of autism and about neurodiversity. Um, Similar to Sarah, I had all these interventions about um, feminist theory and women's studies. And though I didn't have as much influence there in my early education, in my more centrally graduate education, I was able to pick up more of that. And so all of us have these like very interesting career trajectories, and I hope we can explore that a little bit more now. But let's go in the same order and ask this question. So what does neuroethics look like in your field? But like more specifically, what methods do you use? What kinds of interventions do you take on? What does doing neuroethics mean to you? Let's start with Assad.
Yeah. So I'm trying to think of which of the different projects will make a better example. Um, one of the actually, this is a good example. So one of the major interests of mine, the rest of this panel too, is the relationship between artificial intelligence and neuroscience, especially as used in neurotechnology. And so one of the projects in my lab that I've been working on is, as mentioned, sort of creating this, well, going towards creating the basically machine learning based method of predicting when a seizure might happen in mice. And the goal of this project would be to translate this to humans. And so one of the interesting questions then is, how do we determine which artificial intelligence or machine learning model to use in such a device, right? Because there's a lot of ethical issues surrounding AI, things like interpretability, transparency, privacy, etc., etc. And so when I was doing this work of, choosing which AI model to use, it leads to when we're applying this to neural signals, there are unique questions that arise. And so for me, how I sort of integrated this in that is that I intentionally chose different models based on the fact that, some of these more harder to interpret models might lead to war or might lead to such ethical issues becoming more difficult to parse out. And so for me, it was sort of using it as a sort of guiding how I did my research basically in this context. So, yeah, I ran into a bit of opposition in this argument that, the question would be like, if the model works, then why not just use a better model? But then, that's just sort of ignoring these questions or concerns that even if it works better, doesn't necessarily mean it's not really accounting for these broader ethical issues. And so that's one of the ways that this is sort of showed up in the work that I do.
Absolutely. I'm going to push you a little bit here, though. I find a lot of the translational research that you do very interesting and important, and a big part of that is thinking about what sleep research means for marginalized groups.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that a little bit as well?
Yes. So that is another project that I've been working on. So the question here is more, how do we account for the fact that despite knowing all the disparities that exist in sleep and sleep research, both in terms of women, ethnic, racial minorities, so on and so forth, despite knowing about all these disparities, why do they still emerge? And, what are some of the ways in which these disparities are potentially being sort of remade in the way that we research sleep generally. And so for that's more of an interrogation of like how we're doing sleep research and some of the assumptions or social sort of values that we're coming into sleep research with. So that is more sort of that project, more of what I'm focusing there is how we might be able to, potentially change the way that some of the ways that we do sleep research in order to account for these, just assumptions and values that, we as sleep researchers come into sleep research, but also research in general.
Absolutely. Very important work. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. All of it, not just the last part, but
Yes.
all of it. Thank you. Laura?
Yeah, so what does neuroethics look like in my field? So it is weird when you are in kind of doing interdisciplinary work because your field feels like, what is my field? A little bit,
Yeah.
right? So I am currently based on the College of Engineering. So a lot of my colleagues are engineering and neuroscientists. So a lot of the work I see myself doing is, so obviously I have my research. I do a lot of research on public perceptions around different new technologies, and I'm gonna go a little bit in depth in there in terms of the methods that I use, because I think that was part of the question that you asked, Tim. So a lot of the work I do for my research involve using things like surveys, interviews, focus groups, community conversations. So again, I've been trying to use more novel and dynamic and engaging tools, as Sarah was saying, right, to bring to think different publics about what are the social, ethical implications of using, developing, deploying these technologies and neuroscientific advances. So that's kind of the method that I use for my research. But I think another important role I see myself as in being a neuroethicist is how do I reach out through my professional networks and kind of plant seeds among my colleagues about this is an important thing for you to be thinking, right? I don't want to convert neuroethicists, but I do want them to start thinking about the implications of their work. So I've engaged, through the INS, through the IEEE, which is another, large professional organization for engineers, try to actively work either through different, subcommittees and things like that in making sure that we are engaging the profession to think through all of these things. So And kind of heading to the last part that Tim asked us to think about, like what doing neuroethics means to me is, first and foremost, I think it's making sure that people don't assume that we are the police and come to say, don't do that. But more and more is like, I really want to make your work and your research impactful in a positive way that can benefit society or the majority of the people in good ways, right? So that's like what neuroethics really means to me. Like, how can I have this positive impact through the different cycles of development and research and implementation that goes in neuroscience and neurotechnology.
I would love to,
Absolutely.
if I may, I want to just comment on what Laura said because that resonated a lot with me. I think from my experience, there's often a conflation of like ethics and legality or governance or something, all these things get thrown in. And so then people become afraid to talk to you, or they feel like you're going to be burdensome in your research. And so a lot of like what I've had to do, which is a framing, but it's also genuine, is like, no, like, you're my colleague, like we're in this together and I'm going to benefit hopefully from it too. Like this is a relational ethics thing as opposed to just like I'm going to find all of what's wrong here and I'm going to like do something about it. So I just like when you said that,
Yeah.
Laura, I was like, yeah, I feel you. Feel you.
And I completely agree because a lot of times people don't realize that ethics is a field of inquiry. It's not a fixed thing. I think a lot of people are used to dealing with codes of ethics, and a code of ethics seems like a codified thing. It's like a document, we don't break it, we don't revise it. It's like our constitution. And much of ethics isn't like that. There are lively debates between people about what even is the right theory to have in general, or how to apply it, or what it even means to follow through on it, so on and so forth. And so, in a lot of cases, just to underscore what you both have said, um, when I'm doing ethics, I'm doing an investigation that will also benefit my career. Like this is me trying to figure these things out with a group of scientists. I mean, you all are scientists. I'm like the least scientific one on this panel because I don't have any science degrees, which is fine, right? Um, but like I'm doing philosophy in real time, and that's fun and that's rewarding. Um, Sarah, take it away. Let's hear hear what your ethics means to you.
Yeah, I think it's changed a lot for me, especially as I've gone from like more like applied neuroscience research to now more of this like higher level like frameworks and such. I think if I had to distill it down, the way that neuroethics kind of shows up in my work is I'm always it's very easy with technology to treat technology as just this object that is like distilled from people and like it's a thing that you can study on its own. And I'm constantly going, no, like where's the person? Where are the people? Like, I'm just trying to think more holistically about people. And that's a lot of times how it shows up for me. So more concretely, like when I started IBM, we had a client project in I guess it was a mix of like digital health and then neuromodulatory space. And I think this relates to what Assad, you said. It's like there's already these known like discrepancies in pain treatment between,
Mhm.
men and women, and also people who don't identify as a man or a woman. There's all these things, racial discrepancy. Like there's this whole history of this. So if you go in and you already know that, that's going to change your approach to how like you do the research. It's going to change the questions you ask. Like you can assume like, yes, let's just study pain from 1 to 10, or let's just, look at these metrics. But it like, for me, I'm like, no, we need to ask like physicians, we need to ask patients, like, what do they want to measure? Like it
Mhm.
changes what you ask from the get-go. It changes how you even think about access to technologies. Like, okay, you want someone to fill out this questionnaire every day on their smartphone. Do they have a smartphone? Do they have internet access? Like, you want them to come in? Like, do they have a car? Like, can they afford that? Like, do they trust coming into the medical system, or did something bad happen to them before? Like, there's all this stuff that comes up. And I think like for me, it's always about like, how do I interact with people to collect data that's actually meaningful based on those lived experiences and gives access to more people. And then I think it also kind of looks like just constantly, like I said, thinking about like the human and person perspective. Again, going back to machine learning or generative AI or all these things, we're so focused on models and model outcomes and this type of thing. And I'm going, well, what about the person? Like, what is the mental health aspect of people interacting with these things? What is the cognitive changes that happens? What is the workload burden of people that are developing these technologies? So I'm always kind of constantly coming back to the person. And that's, I think, what it looks like for me.
Absolutely. Yeah. The person should, well, I don't know, maybe that's going too far, but certainly in my own research, the person is supposed to take center stage. And I think that's absolutely key for people to remember. I guess I should answer the question as well. I feel like I'm stepping in too much as a moderator, but I will. So as far as neuroethics methods and what neuroethics looks like for me, that's changed recently. I used to do a lot of work on brain-computer interfaces more centrally, especially implanted devices for essential tremor, Parkinson's, um, and also epilepsy. So what they call bidirectional closed-loop stimulators. So devices that read from the brain and stimulate the brain to have some kind of therapeutic effect. And the questions that I would ask in that space are, do these devices impact a person's agency, their autonomy? So do they influence how they make decisions, their relationships with other people insofar as they make decisions? And also, do they have a relationship with the device? And that was my special sauce to say, okay, this device is an agent of sorts. It makes decisions kind of, sorta. And it makes decisions about a patient, a person. And it takes some input from that patient. It takes some input from the clinician, the doctor. But in some of these devices, especially when they're machine learning driven, they operate in some ways autonomously, right? Um, and so, what is the relationship between the person and their device? That used to be the big question. And I would do surveys, I would do interviews with patients who had those systems in either in an experimental context. They were using some next generation version of a device that had more capabilities than the stock ones. Or there are people who have the stock device and they're imagining what it might be like to have that new one. Does it seem lucrative? Will they get benefit? Well, do they see problems? Recently, I've shifted over more toward neuroscientific research more generally, like so laboratory research that doesn't face patients as much. And that's because I've been working more on these brain atlasing projects through the National Institutes of Health's Brain Initiative. They're what they're calling a cell atlas network. Um, I'm working on a project that is being called the Human Mammalian Brain Atlas Project, where they're taking whole brain donations from human beings and from non-human animals and doing very in-depth genetic assays to figure out what kinds of cells are in the brain and how they're connected and how they function in life and how they look post-mortem. And so the questions there have been more like, why aren't we recruiting from more diverse populations to do these essays? What does representation even mean when we're only collecting 6 or 7 specimens, maybe 10 to 15 specimens? What do communities who are marginalized hope to benefit from this study? Like, what do they hope to get from these studies other than, um, other than, a whole lot of work and a whole lot of trauma. I'm thinking specifically of families that have to fill out a very, very long questionnaire on behalf of the loved one that they lost recently. Um, and what do we mean by things like, oh, I want a neurotypical brain? What does that even mean? um, and so the methods that I've been using in that context are just like talking to people. I'm going to do interviews with the investigators. We're going to try to make some interventions, write papers together, just get our hands dirty together. So this is what a lot of people call embedded ethics. And I mean, everyone on this panel has been embedded in a lot of different ways. So I just wanted to get that term out on the table. Um, Okay, so that's enough of me blathering. Um, so let's move to another related topic to bring some of these threads together. What are the risks and opportunities of collaborations between academia and industry? I'm gonna ask everybody this question, but I've got my eyes on Sarah and Laura because y'all have been collaborating for a while now, and I really want to hear about the perils and the benefits. Um, but let's start with Assad.
Yeah, I guess I can only speak to this a little more theoretically because I haven't really engaged with the more industry side of things too much. But
Sure.
like my initial hesitation, like if I will, I haven't like done an industry work yet, but if I were to, I imagine my initial hesitation would be the conflict between making a device uh made to basically, you know, aid human health as much as possible. The conflict between that motive and the profit motive that, all companies will have, right? Like, my impression is that working in an industry, there's always the pressure to make a device that is able to be sold to as many people as possible in order to generate as much profit as possible. Um, and yeah, I guess I was just worried, just like how much would that, because then, there's the flip side of things where let's say a company is really trying to make the devices, as effective as they can. But then there's the worry that they might get out of the business because they're not generating that profit. And so what happens to the patients that have these devices already implanted, and they were relying on them when the company goes out of business. I guess those are the two worries that come to my head. But again, I haven't really engaged with industry as much.
Absolutely. And one doesn't have to look too far for examples of that, right? Second Sight and their Argus 2 platform. This is the bionic eye. And I don't know, I forget what the outlet was. I think it was ProPublica, but an article that was entitled "These Bionic Eyes Are Now Obsolete." And what a title. But that was a startup, so that's really difficult.
Yeah,
And
I remember
uh,
there was another company making a epilepsy monitoring device that also went out of
uh,
business and still sort of, you know, left the patients relying on it so up in the air as well. And similarly, this was a startup, I'm pretty sure.
yeah, I forget the name of that one, but I know exactly what you're talking about, the little pager style device.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that. Laura, do you want to tell us what the risk and perils, I mean the perils and opportunities are?
So I think, oftentimes, and I have many colleagues that like see industry as like never, right? Like go away from me. Like, they feel like they were gonna be kind of tainted if they collaborate with industry, right? And I mean, there might be historical reasons why, they might have that impression. And there's certainly also examples of industry kind of using academic ethicists, philosophers, and kind of using them for ethics washing, right? Kind of like, oh, we have this board of ethicists, and therefore our products are ethical, right? Kind of and kind of having that stamp, but not really engaging them in a meaningful way, right? So that's the risk, that there is this power imbalance or these biases that from both sides. But there's also a lot of opportunities that can come from partnership, right? For me, it's like they're a key stakeholder, a key group to engage with, right? Because they're developing. So we want to make sure that they also have these considerations in the top of their agenda. And though they do have, key responsibilities to their shareholders and, make sure that they are profitable, they also have social responsibilities to the communities in which they are embedded. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to try to create a culture in which this is the norm. Like, this is like, of course, we need to have a board that includes an ethicist and that they have a say in, right? And I mean, that's not an easy task. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, but I think the opportunity is there to figure out ways in which meaningfully engage these partnerships. With the Genome Project, that was a clear example in which it showed that really to achieve the level of speed for a great outcome, you really need these partnerships, right? Like academia can work very slow to get, an outcome. Industry sometimes can work so fast that it kind of misses the point why they want to get there, right? And so I think if you incorporate both perspectives, there's potential to create even better, greater things. So that's kind of how I see things. I'm trying to be balanced, knowing that there are risk and perils that can come from these collaborations.
Absolutely. Yeah. Sarah, do you want to jump in and add?
Yeah. So I'll start with where Laura left off. I mean, I agree with what both you and Assad said. I think to your point of if we consider different groups of people, stakeholders, it would be really weird to not go, how do these stakeholders work? What are their processes? What are their barriers? So I think in that way, it's important just getting to know this is how science, ethics, whatever works in a different part of the space. And so I think that's always a good thing to do. Practically sometimes, working with industry, you can get access to state-of-the-art things that might be really difficult otherwise, right? Like models, data. You might have more money to do things that you really want to do. Those are these real things that happen. And at the same time, I echo all the other risks that can happen. Laura, you mentioned ethics washing. A lot of times I see things like diversity washing, a lot of oh, we're going to hire certain people or we're going to involve people in participatory stuff. And then for what? It's we did the thing, look at this, and then it's done. I also think there's a lot of potentially, you talked about power dynamics, but very specifically extraction, of, okay, cool, we're going to build this with you, we're going to do this thing. And then it's well, who owns the data? Who owns the result? Who owns the IP? What happens after? That's very, tumultuous. And I think there's just difficulties in general. There's different freedoms. In academia, you can write a grant to do something. And of course, you're constrained still by what is important socially. But oftentimes in industry, you're very much constrained by what is important for a product or business. There's different definitions of success. What is success? What is impact? What is a goal? Timeframes are radically different. And I think, Assad, you already touched on this, but I was thinking about abandonment as well and that whole obsolescence piece. And, I think right now, and maybe it's also, Laura, I'd be interested to hear your take on this as an engineer, but a lot of times what I see is a lot of tech companies, they do have a lot of engineering mindsets, which is about building. It's about building and creating anew, and designers are, creators, right? And these are great. We need that. But it's less sexy, less cool to concentrate on maintaining. And what does that mean? So all of these things, I think academia probably has that too, but it's very obvious to me in industry that can more easily happen. So
I think I want to jump in and put a couple of guardrails on this conversation. There are a few things that I think are important to remember that I might get in trouble for this, but everything that you've said, all of you have said so far, the the risks that people face in collaborating with industry, I'm identifying more and more of those same issues in collaborating with my colleagues in academia as well, right? So, like the idea of ethics washing. um, I've had a number of colleagues from computer science want us to put essentially an ethics kite mark on their product. This is in academia. Uh, I've seen a number of people who want to diversity wash their work as well, right? I mean, like that's the running project of most universities is to diversity wash the student population, the faculty population, their staff, so on and so forth. Things are not as diverse as they want them to be or are willing to put money into. Um, but also to answer my own question, I think in all of my interactions with industry, I've found that one of the big drivers for those interactions is how hungry the person in industry is to do ethics, right? Everyone I've ever interacted with has gone, okay, I'm really interested in doing ethics. We have infrastructure here, but we need your help, right? As we all need help in every area. I mean, and I've gotten similar reach outs from the public sector. People who work in government who want to raise awareness of something or figure out how to run some government program and put on an event or something like that. I think that, representation matters in industry and academia. And when you are underrepresented and you're trying to raise awareness of issues that you face, and if you're working at a neuroscience company of some sort that are distinctly neuroethical, hey, you're going to turn to whoever you can turn to. And that's where the both risks and opportunities come out of. And I think that's really the moral of the story. Um, we are swiftly running out of time, but I think we're getting questions now, but I think we can do one more question before we jump into the Q&A. I really want to ask this question about artificial intelligence and neuroscience, since we all have that special synergy. So I'll go around and I'll keep my opinion to myself this time. So, what do you think is the biggest ethical challenge for integrating AI with neuroscience? We'll start with Assad, as always. Go for it.
Yeah, I think the one of the biggest challenges is the fact that one, we don't really understand neuroscience all that well yet. And then two,
Hmm.
we don't really understand artificial intelligence all that well yet. And so
Hmm.
then if you're adding these two complex, barely understood systems together, there's a whole host of ethical issues that might arise that, like, where do we even begin to address them when we barely understand the two systems on their own?
Absolutely. Yeah. And as we're starting to understand, they're a little bit linked. If we're talking about, artificial neural networks and large models that use them, what we call a neuron in the AI space is like a tinker toy of a neuron. And there are lots of efforts to make that much more robust, much more biomimetic, like make our neural nets more like brains. So pretty interesting, but we don't understand either, right? So really interesting stuff. Laura?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to pick like the biggest ethical one because I think there's so many things that
Oh yeah.
that are very relevant. But the one I want to mention is this issue of like epistemic authority, right? And because we've seen
Yeah.
some headlines about how some medical systems already were deploying AI systems, and they were not having, the outcomes were harming people. And so if you are having AI systems, let's say in a neuro device, and this is creating more stimulation for certain populations than for others, I mean, this is harming people, and that's one thing. But in terms of the epistemic authority is if the AI is telling the clinician something about the patient, and the clinician is taking that more to be more important than what the actual patient is telling them that they're feeling, I think that's gonna create, and it's already creating tensions, right? And so that to me is a big ethical challenge at the intersection of both systems.
Absolutely. That's so important. Yeah, absolutely. Sarah, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, again, we could go into either of those in more depth. How do you pick one? I'm trying to pick something that's different. I guess one thing that I'm concerned with is like not just data, but like the politics around data.
Mhm.
So like AI has really influenced neuroscience in terms of like what counts as enough data and like sample size. Like we're seeing that already. So it's changing that. It's changing our conversations about data sharing and privacy and all of this. But then there's all these politics too about when something does become neurodata or not for models, and like people can skirt around that. And I because to Assad's point, we don't have like we don't exactly know what we're doing in either case. There's not clear guidelines, there's not clear definitions to these things. Like putting them together, even in terms of like data labeling and such, to me just creates a whole host of issues, ethical and otherwise. So
Absolutely. Yeah. I promised I wouldn't I wouldn't add my stamp, but I'm so tempted. Both of you have said some really interesting things right now. Um, but I guess to close out this panel, I think we should ask, what advice would you give somebody who is looking to get more involved in neuroethics? Um, I think to switch it up, let's go in reverse order. Sarah, you go first.
all right, I'm going to try to be brief because I know there's Q&A. This might sound really strange, but I would actually say to be creative. I still think even neuroethics, we're still trying to define what that means. And maybe in some ways we're nebulous on purpose, and that's a good thing. So it's not like, I think hopefully everybody has seen that neuroethics doesn't look like one way. Like we all have very different
Right.
experiences. So there might be certain interests that you can make those ties to and like be extremely creative with it, like different, unique. There's room for that. So again, it's kind of when I say that, it's kind of like lean into that, like lean into like those unique aspects of yourself when you're like talking to people or trying to figure out your research direction and such, because it doesn't have to look a certain way and it might not look the same in 5 years. So yeah, I don't know if that's helpful, but yeah, be creative.
Absolutely. 100%. Laura.
I remain in the middle. Like Sarah, you said that it was gonna be a little bit weird, but that's actually the advice that I give a lot to my students, right? Like I say, like,
Mhm.
your creativity is the limit of how you shape your career trajectory, right? Like, because now more than previous years, we have more flexibility in how we create interdisciplinary paths that don't look anything like what they used to look a couple of decades ago. Even what is neuroscience, there's now so many more ways in which people do neuroscience than in the past. So really, how can people, they always kind of follow your passion, and maybe they have an interest in neuroethics, but that's not like, they don't want that to become their every day a week type of thing, and that's fine. But then find ways in which you can keep in touch with other people that's their job, and you can have conversations, and you can keep abreast of the topics that are relevant in a particular time and context, and like go to events organized by like this network, the Neuroethics, the INS, right? Like I think there's different ways in which the field has a menu that cater for different interests and levels of interest, right? Like if you want to be deeply embedded, kind of going back to the word that Tim mentioned, reach out to people that you admire or that you see their work and you say like, oh, this was a really cool study, I want to learn more, and reach out to them, right? I think that's always like a good way to get to know more about the field and the different ways in which neuroethics is practiced. And if you're not there, I think, but you still have an interest, just become member of places where you can keep hearing about what's important and relevant in the field.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're all here as a resource. So please make use of us. Please reach out. Assad, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, what came to mind is sort of, going off of what both Sarah and Laura said is like basically don't be afraid. And I mean that in two different ways. One, in terms of what Sarah was saying, creativity, being creative. Um, like so I taught a sort of neuroethics kind of class a year and a half ago, and this is all like biology students, seniors. And one of the things that I noticed is that it seemed like they weren't super used to thinking about neuroscience in the way that we were trying to encourage them to do. And I think when I say don't be scared, I mean like try like thinking about neuroscience in these different ways. And by being here is already a very nice step. But there's just like so many different ways that you can think about and interact with neuroscience. And the second part is, and this is going off what Laura said and also what Tim just said, is, you know, I found that a lot of these individuals in the neuroethics field are super willing and super friendly to talk with, people who are interested in neuroethics. And so, in some ways, a matter of just like going up to someone like Tim Brown and being like, hey, I like your stuff. Can we talk, please? Like something that simple, I think, is, they'd be more than happy to chat about it.
Absolutely. Um, I don't think I have anything to add on top of that, but honestly, like these are all really good pieces of advice. And I guess I would sort of extend Assad's if I had to give advice, um, and say don't be afraid to have the hard conversations about really difficult subjects, because we're in a socio-political space more broadly where we're having to tackle all the hard questions at once, and it's good to have solidarity, right? And it's good to find your people and figure out how to make headway on some of these really difficult subjects. And as the broader sociopolitical world sort of rushes into neuroethics, I think it's even more important to be kind to one another, be kind to yourselves, um, and to really uh, show the. I don't want to say be courageous, but because like that's a tall ask, but certainly don't shy away from the really hard questions that come up in your research, in your communities, so on and so forth, because those are the really transformative conversations. It can change your career trajectory, and it certainly has for all of us on this panel, right? So, um, with that said, I want to, I don't know, this is Zoom, so we can't give a round of applause, right? I guess we can. As many of you as possible, put up your clap emojis and give our panelists a round of applause. They're wonderful, and I'm really appreciative of the knowledge you just shared. It's amazing. Excellent. Okay, and with that said, let's move into our Q&A session. Um, and let's start with, you know what? Let's start at the top. Here's a question, especially for Asad. So Carolyn asks, as higher ed becomes run more and more like a corporation, do you feel that your interests or research or ethics are being shaped by what will bring your university more money or more status and thus more money?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this question. And I guess my immediate response would be it kind of depends on both the lab that you're in and the space that you're in. Um, Definitely in terms of the more like quote unquote hard like neurotech research. Um, it definitely is like there's more and more of this sort of like outside influence. I'm thinking about like, it's pretty common for neurotech related labs to be funded by DARPA, so much more, these ties with like military, like dual use and so on and so forth. Um, and so in that regard, there is that sort of pressure of like, okay, I have to shift my focus more towards these questions rather than those. I personally am a bit of a troublemaker and will gladly bite the hand that feeds me if given the chance. There was a paper I was on recently where we, directly interrogated this idea of dual use neurotechnology. So yeah, the answer in short is yes, but there's also, again, I try to be a little bit of a real bender and push back against it if I can.
I love that. Laura, go ahead.
This one, it's not just, I think unfortunately some of our research does get shaped by what funders are willing to fund. And so that is something that, yeah, we have kind of a lot of freedom, but within those freedoms, if you're in need to get funding for your research, there's, only certain funders that do get to fund neuroethics. That has, increased in the past years. Before it was more narrow, there's more opportunities now, but that is still sometimes has very specific areas that they're planning to fund or particular methods that are, encouraged to use in order to get funded. So that we're already facing that as a problem in terms of ethics funding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that more generally, what gets funded and what doesn't get funded is largely a function of like your previous prestige, your demonstrated ability to get projects done, but also how sexy the project is, right? And I think that, in ethics, we haven't been able to run away from that either, right? So we have to be pretty careful about, um, over promising or I worry about exploitation, about the possibility that we might be taking a person's really difficult ethics case and turning it into a source of profit, right? Um, Sarah, do you want to jump in a little bit, or no?
Yeah, I don't honestly have much because I haven't had that experience of being in higher ed now. So yeah, I'm not really sure if I could comment.
Absolutely. And so let's move on to another question. Um, this one's from Guaraf, who writes, "What would you say to someone whose primary focus is in neuroscience research? How can they incorporate neuroethics into what they already do if it isn't or can't be uh, their primary focus?" And maybe we'll start with, well, since we keep going through Laura as the middle person, let's start with Laura.
Yeah, well, sometimes it depends a lot of the flexibility of the academic program in which one is embedded. Oftentimes, at least here in my institution, one can do this as a minor. If you're an undergrad or if you're a grad student, you can also include that. And so you could include a chapter of your dissertation as part of neuroethics. But if even that, like that's a lot, I would think, go and check if there's any neuroethics initiatives within your university. Or again, like the International Neuroethics Society, number of webinars and activities throughout the year. So there's many ways in which you can kind of incorporate yourself, even though if your university doesn't already have a good mechanism for you to get involved, right?
Absolutely. Sarah, anything to add since you were in this situation as well?
Yeah, I was like, I can give plenty of advice on this one. So one thing I would say, this goes back to my earlier point about being creative. Like, it doesn't have to be a big splash that now you're suddenly doing neuroethics. It can be, you know what, I'm really worried about consent. Can I change the consent practice here? Like, it can't, like, there's so many ways that you can weave like a neuroethical issue or framework into what you're currently doing. So I'll just say that, but there's like other things. I mean, what Laura said, like one of my dissertation chapters was all about the ethics of placebo. So, like I weaved it in. I also, I mean, this might not be for everybody, but I ended up talking to my program director and was like, I've already had a lot of these classes, instead of taking these classes, can I take ethics classes in place for my, extracurriculars? And as long as I do X, Y, and Z with this, and I got approval. So there's kind of creative ways to do this. And I think too, like, sometimes even after the fact, you might be able to kind of have some sort of reflective exercise and even a paper on that reflective exercise of like, what are the neuroethical issues of what it was that you were doing? So, which is also something that I've done. So I think, yeah, I think there's a lot of ways, even if it's not like your formalized primary focus, that you can still get it in there or do something with it, either while or after the fact. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. This ongoing advice of being creative, it's clutch. And I think that I've seen a lot of creativity. But I just want to put an underline on the advice, that it doesn't have to be a big thing, right? It can be a small thing. But also you can just think, what are the things that bother me about my project? Just that. Just ask yourself that question. What are the things that bother you about your project? Um, and oftentimes that'll turn into a section. And I think the way I like to think of it is, if I didn't think of this, then my project would have been incomplete anyway. That's how I like to go into conversations with people who would stand in the way of putting such and such into the project, right? So when you say, uh, uh, if we can't incorporate neuroethics into what we already do, if it isn't our primary focus, and if it can't be, it doesn't have to be, but the best neuroethics issues are things that you have to deal with anyway. Assad, do you want to jump in since you had to do some of this yourself?
Yeah, no, I was gonna say like what you just said is sort of the perfect segue into what I've been thinking. And also is echoing what
Mm-hmm.
Sarah said. Like in my mind, you don't really have to incorporate neuroethics into neuroscience because it's already kind of there. And to me, it's more,
Mm.
you know, expressing the curiosity about, like what Tim just said, like exploring these ideas a little more, and like interrogating, like, why are we doing it this way when it could be done that way, right? Like similar to Laura and Sarah, one of my chapters was that I mentioned this, the studying like neuroethics of sleep research and sort of interrogating a lot of the conventions that we have. And for that one, I was pretty lucky that my graduate mentor like kind of trusted me and just kind of let me do whatever. And so I didn't even officially like declare that I was going to do neuroethics research. I just kind of started doing it, and it just sort of evolved into its own like chapter on its own. And so in that case, that was more again me just being like, this seems interesting. I want to do that. And again, I was lucky to have a mentor that sort of trusted me to go that direction. But it still very much is filled by, looking at what is in front of me and being like, why, basically. Basically channel your inner toddler and ask why.
I love it. Okay, so let's move on to one of these more neuroethics focused questions. Abby asks, if the panel has any impressions about remuneration for patients and participants in neuroscience research. Um, Abby often thinks about the balance between reimbursing participants for their time, particularly if they're giving up a lot of it, right? So, like in implantable neurotech trials, versus the reimbursement not influencing participation. So, like in the case of somebody needing the money, so needing to participate as a result. Um, I'm not sure who to start with on this one. Who wants to address this a little bit?
I can start.
Sure.
I think there's not an easy answer, as with many of the theoretical questions that we pose ourselves. Right, there's like a lot of nuances to consider. And one of the reasons why I mentioned this is because sometimes, when we're in review panels and this comes, it's very different when you're thinking about remunerating someone that, let's say, is going to a brain-computer interface trial, right? This person might be a paraplegic or have no mobility, like really they have no income source. And so thinking about remuneration from that perspective of neuroscience participant versus I am doing interview study and I'm paying, people to just tell me about their opinion, right? And so I think we need to be careful with what we're asking people to do, and also who are we asking to do this for us, right? And so that's why I think it becomes difficult to say, oh, this is the right answer, because there's a lot of considerations to have in place. I do think that when we are talking about some of these brain-computer interface trials where people are going there for several hours a day, and again, they have no other income, I mean, it seems fair to have a remuneration that, you know, helps them to account for that, versus if we just asking for like 45 minutes or an hour of their time.
I think all of these are really important points. And I kind of just want to add that our decision to remunerate or not remunerate has an influence on who's able to participate, right? So the question of who is the person that we're approaching to do this research can also be flipped around. The converse question might be who is left over when we don't remunerate, and the only people who participate are people who want to be on the frontier, right? And so, like one of the projects that I was on, doing interviews with participants, they were all white guys, older white guys, retired, who had the time and space and whose families wanted to put them somewhere, to be frank. And this was, something that became a theme, right? Like, so this is something that will get grandpa stimulated with some company, so on and so forth. But that's a huge biasing factor in the research, right? And so it turns into a representation issue, right? Assad, Sarah, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I don't have this is what we should do or not, but I'm reflecting back on like my work back in grad school with pain patients. And to Tim's point, we were trying to get people from all over Chicago and try to make sure that we could get as representative as the Chicago population as possible with respect to also the chronic pain condition we were looking at. And in addition to time, I mean, let's think about what people had to do. They came in, they filled out tons of questionnaires. They completed an hour brain scan. They might have been physically poked and prodded. They were asked to take home. They were asked to take home a phone and rate twice a day for weeks. Maybe they had to be given medication. Now, it is possible that some people weren't in pain and they were doing that. But one, they're putting in labor. It's more than time. It's like we don't have data without them. And two, like within that social context of we're already dealing with a population that is used to not being believed. Like it's just the thing of like, oh, well, I don't know if like it becomes really hairy. And so, we ended up going, we were given this grant money to do this in this way, and we're going to err on the side of believing people and getting more people to come in. Even if that might have repercussions for data, it might have all these things, but like we'd rather go that way than to your point of like excluding and further traumatizing people. So I mean, it's a really good question, but it's super hard.
Absolutely. One of the hardest questions we have, actually. Especially when we think of like our obligations to patients afterwards as well, right? So like, these questions of like, is this replacing their job? And how much should we be asking them to do? Yeah, this gets really difficult. But then, do we pay for their explants if they want explants? Do we give them compensation for any follow-ups? So on and so forth. It just gets even more and more complicated. Assad, do you have any thoughts before we move on?
Yeah. Similarly, I've been, it's a really tough question. Because there's arguments for keeping, like I'm thinking about like this like blanket, like we'll pay you $15 for 1 hour of your time, kind of like experiments. And there's arguments towards keeping that number low in order to like actually get people, but then it leads to the problem that Tim mentioned of sampling bias. Otherwise, you could think of, well, if we paid them a lot more, then that leads to questions of like, okay, do these people actually fit the study? And I guess what I was thinking about is, I think part of the problem is the sort of lack of focus on study goes particular like context, like just giving like a flat like $15 for an hour, like that might mean nothing to like someone who's independently wealthy, but might be really important for someone who is relatively destitute. Yeah, I was just thinking about that, how to incorporate that sort of flexibility of paying patients differently depending on, yeah, it gets all really just really complicated.
Mhm.
And I clearly don't have a good answer for it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Different funding models. Wow. Yeah, I can imagine that. Um, I think this is going to be our last question, and I'm going back and forth, but um, I guess I'll take the last question from Robert Beats, who runs things over at INS, a lot of things over at INS, a lot of interactions over the years. And Robert asks, how has what you've learned from neuroethics helped you provide unique value to the institution's teams and contexts in which you work through scholarship, related disciplines, or specific people, and how they've helped change your perspective or maybe introduced you to a new technique or methodology? Um, who wants to go first?
I don't know if I've gone first yet, so I'll try it.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's hard to put into words because I think it's like going back to some other things that we've all said. It's like maybe I've been doing neuroethics longer than I've formally been doing neuroethics. So it's really hard to go, what have I learned from this? But I think because neuroethics is so multidisciplinary, and when you meet different folks and everyone's coming from different backgrounds, you have these like really rich conversations. And I mean, I even got into Tim's like journal club way back when, and I got to meet more people. And I think that only helps when I go into a new situation or I'm talking with colleagues that I don't have that background. And now I'm like learning how to communicate differently, how to interact differently, how to ask different questions, how to remain open. And this could be true of more than just neuroethics, but for me personally, that sort of like multi-lens kind of traversing multiple disciplines at once, like many of us are coming from, neuroscience and something else, or have been embedded within a neuroscience lab, like that is a skill. It is a skill to be able to kind of hold multiple things once and have that language. And I think that has helped me immensely in scholarship and discussions with people and the frameworks that I use and create. So yeah.
Absolutely. I think that is definitely underappreciated how interdisciplinarity is a skill and guiding people through difficult situations and contexts is a skill. It's really difficult and really rewarding. Does anyone else want to add?
Yeah, I can get on that. I think and this is sort of going like echoing what Sarah just said, is being able to really like it doesn't feel like a different lens at this point, but you sort of use
Hmm.
these different lenses of like neuroactors to sort of, examine the same data set that we have. Like an example that I have is, and this is actually really relevant because I was meeting really good about this. So in my lab, we study sleep and circadian rhythms, and one of the experiments that we did was looking at sleep patterns in homeless individuals in the Seattle community. And as part of that, we like got their activity, so on and so forth. We also had them do surveys. But one of the things that we noticed with the survey data is like, of course they're gonna have a high rate of depression, stress, things, so on and so forth. Like looking at it quantitatively, there's not much that we can get out of that sort of data. But one of the skills that I got from, participating in this neuroethics world with like NeuroEthics here and everyone is being able to do this more qualitative analysis and get a more in-depth picture of like what these individuals are going through and experiencing in themselves. And what's been really nice is that, this is, I think, one of the first times this lab is doing this more qualitative analysis. And so, you know, basically being able to like go out and then bring this new piece into the lab has been super, like, just super cool to see, especially because, having them look at is like the main sort of focus of all of this work. And yeah, just seeing her excitement and being able to bring this more qualitative element into the lab has just been super fun to see. And I don't know if I would have been able to do this as well if I hadn't been involved in this neuroethics world.
Absolutely. That's my experience mirrors that as well. Laura, do you want the last word? No, maybe not the last word, but
No, not the last word, but I can maybe mention something about, I think it's not just unique to neuroethics. I would say that it's unique to my training as an applied ethicist. And I think it's really bringing this, analytical skill set of, ask this number of questions, who are the key groups involved? What is the moral salience of the problem? Like all of these things that sometimes we ignore, but that are so key when you are looking into these socio-technical systems, right? And so really keeping your critical thinking hat and asking questions, but also be creative, or try to be creative with the type of solutions that you incorporate in your work and in your teams. So I think that's something that has been really beneficial from applied ethics.
And just to take my own shot at the question as well, a lot of what I've learned as a neuroethicist hasn't been from the perspective of coming into the humanity side of it, because I had the humanity side behind me the whole time. It's been more about what I've learned in this embedded context with people from across the sciences. And one of the things I picked up very quickly is this practical attitude toward ethics, rather than this spinning our wheels in space that you get from philosophy sometimes. I think one philosopher, I'm not even going to try to remember who it is at this point, used to remark that his fellow philosophers were spinning frictionless in a void. And that's not what we want to do here. So as soon as I started embedding in laboratories, as soon as I started attending INS meetings, as soon as I started sitting on panels like these, I started to gain a deeper appreciation for how I have to say why my intervention is important, my presence is important, what value I bring. So this is like a meta answer to Robert's question. What did I learn that helped me bring value to teams? It helped me learn that I have value to bring to a team in the first place, because a lot of humanists don't think they bring value to a team. They generally think I'm studying something for its own sake, and some of them are very proud of that fact. I, being embedded in a bunch of groups of scientists and interdisciplinary teams, have had that chipped away from me. So now I have to be practical. I have to be relevant. I have to be useful to myself and others. So, and I think that's really helpful. Yeah. Okay. So we're at the end, pretty much the end of our time. So again, I want to thank our panelists for being such intrepid representatives of neuroethics and being so forthcoming with advice and their time, because I gather all of us have volunteered our time to you as resources to approach as you make the decision to make neuroethics a deeper part of your research trajectory or your career trajectory. So thanks to our panelists. Thanks to everyone. Thanks for the wonderful questions. Thanks to the International Neuroethics Society and the Dana Foundation for making this event possible. Thanks to Emily Rodriguez for bringing us together, and the team at Dana. Yeah, absolutely. We're gonna keep the Zoom open a little bit. So we'll stay as long as we can, but I know everybody has things to do. Absolutely. So if you want to say something or ask us about careers for a little bit, we'll be on for maybe 5 more minutes. please stay on and we can consider this networking time. Samaya, feel free to turn on your mic.
Hi, I just had a question. So I haven't really started anything yet, but I'm kind of looking to work in like neuroeducation with like grade school kids and kind of introduce neuroscience to them on their level. Do you have any advice on how to incorporate neuroethics into this?
Okay, so I've done this in a number of contexts, right? So there's an MIT program called MOSTech for rising juniors, I believe. Can't remember exactly. It's rising juniors, I think. Um, and they have classes on neuroscience and other STEM fields. They asked me to do a neuroethics module. I think it's relatively low risk to put a neuroethics module alongside or weave it into a neuroscience module. You just have to ask the question, what are the ethical issues here? And it also helps to have a little bit of an intro to neuroethics. I know there's a canonical paper that sort of makes a distinction between the ethics of neuroscience and the neuroscience of ethics, and people find that fascinating. Like, if you could put Hannibal Lecter in an MRI machine, which parts of his brain would fire up when he's thinking about eating people, that kind of thing. And I think that if you think about things in terms of cases, interesting ethics conflicts, depending on how young the audience is, honestly, I've had good luck with people as young as 7, maybe even younger. Neuroethics is really interesting. So,
Yeah, thank you.
yeah, no problem. Emily?
Yeah, wait, no, I actually early on, Sarah mentioned kind of like while working in the neuroscience field and with neurotechnologies, running into like patient insurance issues, like running into all of these structural issues when it comes to healthcare infrastructure. I was wondering the degree to which that gets involved in your work, because sometimes when it comes to access, it's like US health insurance, like this huge thing. And sometimes I hear like, oh, some of these neurotechnologies wouldn't be possible if you didn't have like a privatized healthcare system. Like it seems like this can be a pretty big part of the discourse sometimes with access.
Yeah, I don't have much because I'm not doing so much of this work anymore. And I can say a little bit more about what exactly happened. But I to your point, I think this is a huge discussion. Like healthcare systems work differently in different parts of the country, in different parts of the world. And I mean, if we're talking about even just models, like large foundational models that are, giving us advice about things and pulling things in haphazardly, like it this is exactly an issue. But for me, what had happened was we were trying to develop brain biomarkers with patients and clinicians, so with them, to figure out if who's going to potentially develop chronic pain after like an accident, or a bunch of other things. The idea was like, can we triage patients' care better, right? A very specific focus, very specific goal. And then when we published this, that was like, oh, can we treat that biomarker as a pre-existing condition? So that was kind of the context that this was happening. And that's what made me go, why is there no protection for dual or multi-use? Like there's nothing, like, what do I say in a paper? What do I do with this data? Like there's just nothing infrastructurally for me to do anything. And I think it's likely going to get more complicated with AI. So, but to your point, like, yes, like this should be more in the discourse, but I am just not in that space anymore to comment on it.
Cool, thank you.
Absolutely. I forget whose hand was first. Let's go Vaishnavi first. I think you were first.
So I was wondering if there is a time when neurotechnology can get more accurate and we can make uh, predictive models for like health issues, especially for seizures. If there is a time where these become very accurate, what do we do when the patient refuses early intervention, maybe because of denial or like they have mistrust in technology, how do we deal with that?
It's a really great question. It's making me think of a number of possibilities, right? Um, so there's a kind of discourse that already surrounds this in medical spaces, right? So when we talk about patients who may be lower income from certain cultures of scarcity, um, and they get prescribed a medication and then they don't take that medication because they're conserving it or because they're afraid of it or because they don't like the side effects, they don't want to push back on their doctors, they get called by their medical professionals non-compliant, right? And so there's this huge discourse surrounding non-compliance and whether or not a patient is, putting themselves at risk, whether they're morally they're doing something that's morally salient, um, and what you do in the context if you're a medical provider. There's something called moral constraint distress, where a provider will go, "Oh God, I wish this person would just do what I say. I feel like my hands are tied," or "I wish the system would work to my advantage." Um, and if we're talking about neurotechnologies and models that are more and more accurate, but then somebody wants to push back on it, there's a question of what do we mean by accurate, right? Do we mean, something like lines up with someone's values? What if they just don't want to do it? What if they don't trust the machine? What if they want to rage against the machine? It's fine. And that's all part of patient choice, right? So it seems like that we have to prioritize autonomy here over a lot of other concerns, right? The effective patient treatment. We have to throw that, well, we don't have to throw it away, but we have to at least say that we respect the person's autonomy, I think. I don't know what my fellow panelists think of this, but this is something that's like the active thing in my class right now. So I'm kind of primed to talk about this. Anyone want to add thoughts? No?
I think you raise the key ones.
Yeah, that's right. Araceli, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, putting as background the distinction made in the beginning between ethics versus governance, or dealing with neuroethics versus neurogovernance, I suppose most of us, I suppose, more interesting or more like intellectually satisfying the side of ethics or philosophy, possibly. But if you are doing ethics or you are from the side of the ethics, how do you develop like a voice or a communication style in which you can work with the neuroscientist at the same time without alienating them or without them feeling them like threatened? So I mean, I am a neurophysiologist myself, an intracranial human neurophysiologist. So how do you work in a way that they don't feel that, of course, as someone will shut them down, they will lose order funding? I don't know. It's like I have faced the challenge that they kind of just like walk away, right? And yeah, like in this very polarized situation, the same with the topic of, like, for example, the use of non-human primates in research or neuroscience. It's always like very polarizing. So if you say something immediately like can sound like critical, there is like this complete like reaction of going away. So have you find a way to communicate or to approach in a or like pose these concerns in a way that doesn't feel so, I don't know, challenging, alienating, antagonizing?
This is such a great question. Go for it.
So one thing I want to say is it really depends on what your role is. Like, I don't sit on the AI ethics board at my company. Sometimes I come in for certain things when they ask me to, but I'm a researcher. So that in terms of power dynamics, I think that matters a lot, right? So how I approach somebody, if they're on kind of the same kind of power level as me within at least this organization, like that matters. I found Tim spoke to this earlier of like getting your hands dirty. Like it's very easy to remain distant and to look at what someone did and point and whatever. And if you're pointing to somebody whose entire research, 20 years, has been, this and they care about it and everything, like it's just for me, that's not an act of caring. It's not, it's so distant. So a lot of times what I do is I have a lot of meetings with people. I want to get to know, why are they excited about this? Tell me more about your research, right? Like getting to know people and what makes them tick is a big part of this whole thing. Getting your hands dirty. Like when I work with people in AI models, I'm in there with them looking at the data. I'm trying to see what's happening. I'm testing it with them. I want to, I want to see, I want to understand. And then I also often lead with questions. Questions are like, this way of being curious. You don't know the answer. You genuinely want to understand more as opposed to kind of like these should statements or things that I think a lot of times people think ethicists do. Like you should do this or not. Like for me, leading with questions kind of opens up something. It's imperfect. People can still become defensive with questions, but that's been my approach. I would love to know what others though on the panel think.
I've done this in the past, right? Like yeah, rather what you said, Sarah, resonates with me. I've come in asking questions, getting excited, being exuberant about the research. I think I've seen a lot of people do the opposite, where they come in with the police officer's attitude, where they go, impress me. Tell me how your work is above board or what you've done to address ethics already. It's sort of the high school math teacher who expects you to already know the math before they teach it to you attitude toward ethics engagement. And we don't want that. Nobody wants that. It's not a good move. Um, I've found that being the biggest possible nerd has helped me out so many times, right? Like actually understanding the language that they speak goes a long way. So if someone is talking about Fourier transforms, right? Like if you don't know what that is, you should ask them to explain it to you. Most of the people who do this research are excited to tell you what a Fourier transform is and why different methods of doing a Fourier transform are better in different contexts, so on and so forth. They will explain it to you ad nauseum. Don't be afraid of that. Just let them explain it to you and digest it and learn that language, right? Um, and I find that, there are a number of philosophers who argue that there are transactional zones or interaction spaces that you have to build. And I find that nerdiness is the biggest driver of that, right? Being a humanities nerd, a neuroscience nerd, a computer science nerd. And when I joined a laboratory in graduate school, I tell you, learning Linux was clutch. I knew Linux. I could fix their computer better than they could. So, and we had a lot of bonding experiences. So sometimes I think it's like figuring out how to be part of their community in ways that other people in their lab or in their research group would be part of their community because you are part of their community and they're part of yours. And so I think that's extremely important. Assad, speaking of
Yeah.
nerdiness.
Wow, calling me out. And
Calling you out.
I can actually address this from the other side of things. So, like my lab, a major part of like what I've been doing in my lab is working with animals, and there was a lot of debate, generally, about the animal rights, like is it okay to use animals in research, things like that, and like from my perspective, when people have asked me about like how I feel about it, like I tend to be pretty open that, it's not something that I necessarily wanted to do going into grad school. And it's not something that I would have chosen to do. Because, like I try to eat as vegan as I can, I care a lot about animals. Which is to say, like, in many aspects, I feel like the other person would have, put some thought into these questions, especially regarding animal use and research and things like that. And so, like, kind of going along with what Tim and Sarah said, like, I think it's a big part of it is showing that curiosity of like not coming in as a sort of authoritative figure, but more like trying to understand how they think about it and sort of like understand their perspective on things. I think that's sort of just they more than likely will have a perspective that they would be happy to share if it seems like it coming from a place of curiosity rather than paternalism, I guess.
Absolutely. Well, on that note, we're a little over 10 minutes over our time. Thanks to the panelists for staying a little bit longer. And thanks for all the organizers for staying a little bit longer. And thanks for hanging out with us. This is fun. So hopefully we'll see you at the next event. But until that time, thanks for showing up. Thanks for being here, and have a great afternoon.
Great. Thank you so much. This was great. This was really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you for staying after to answer people's questions, including my own. Here, I'll stop the recording.
Thanks.
Let's go.